Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. So, something I realized is that I haven't uploaded on this channel in a very long while. So, I just want to say, if you're wondering when the next every episode of My Little Pony is reviewed is going to be coming out, I don't quite know yet. I've watched every episode once, but I have to watch every episode at least twice before I can actually make a video out of reviewing them. So for now, let's talk about Season 3, because at the end of that video where I reviewed every episode, I never actually rated my top 5 and worst 5 episodes from that season. And since Season 3 is only 13 episodes long, we may as well not go every episode, not just the top and worst 5. So let's start off with the worst half, and then we'll go into the best half, alright? Here we go. Number 6. Just for sidekicks. So something you'll notice right away is that this episode was considered good in my original review, and I stand by that. I think this is a decent sequel to, what was the episode called? Secret of My Excess? Where we're given a little bit more insight on the biology of dragons and why they act the way they do. And in that context, a lot of actions in this episode make a lot more sense than you're probably used to. Like for example, the moment where Zakor donates one of Spike's jewels to charity. There is also ample evidence to show that Spike really didn't care enough for the animals, at least before Angel threatened to squeal on him. And that's a good moral too. If you're given a job, actually do the job. Don't just go in half-hearted just for the promise of getting something you want out of it. If I had any complaints to prevent this episode from being on the good side of this list, it's that this episode really only shows Spike's flaws. Now yes, this is a Spike episode, and as a result, his flaws have to be very apparent, but you need to balance it out somehow, otherwise one of your main characters just looks very dislikable. Moving on to the 5th worst episode of the season, Keep Calm and Flutter On. This is once again a good episode, but I do find this episode to be worse than Just for Sidekicks. And my biggest problem just has to be the pacing. It just feels like things happen way too quickly to really be organic, and this group going from making a mockery out of Fluttershy to genuinely caring about her is a whiplash. It doesn't help either that Fluttershy and Twilight's friends, including Twilight herself, aren't exactly innocent either, with Fluttershy basically weaponizing Discord's emotions against him, and Twilight going as far as looking for a reforming spell to basically rewrite Discord's personality to be something that she wants it to be. That's pretty screwed up for this show. Though in Fluttershy's defense, he basically did the same thing to her in Return of Harmony Part 1. I also kind of appreciate the fact that the main 6 and Princess Celestia aren't immediately convinced that Discord really has changed for the better. It makes him look a lot less naive is what I'm trying to say. I mean, it gives this really uncomfortable air of unease, but at the very least, it's good to note that the main 6 are being cautious. Though at the time, I can imagine this must have raised a lot of questions as far as what Princess Celestia was thinking, since she never really tells Twilight what she intends to do with Discord's magic, or even how it could be used for good. But thanks to the foresight of Twilight's Kingdom and the hindsight that it's about time, it seems we got our answer after all. And fun fact, this is so far the only episode I thought was bad at first, but then thought was good on my rewatching. Number 4. Games Ponies Play. Now we've reached the okay episode of this list. And yes, I said episode, not episodes. What saved this episode for me was I found it really funny, but the story itself was absolutely awful. With how the events of this episode played out, there was no good reason for Miss Harshwini to choose the Crystal Empire to host the Equestria Games. Like, this would have made some sense, only if, let's say, the Crystal Ponies, without the absolutely grandiose introduction, just showed any signs of being hospitable outside of Twilight saying hello just one time, which we see was the first time she was ever greeted in the episode. The means of how the mix-up happened were also just really poor. Twilight describes Miss Harshwini only by one bag that she's holding, and not by any other means of her appearance. There had to be a better way to describe exactly how she looked outside of just what she could be holding. Like, describe more features of the pony, but just have them look very similar, which would explain why they got it confused. The way this episode is set up, it makes Twilight look really dumb. I also just find the framing to be very confusing. The way this is phrased, it looks like a Rainbow Dash episode with how she is so invested and even delivers the moral at the end of the episode too. Maybe if this was a Rainbow Dash episode, her actions would make a little more sense. But as is, she usurps Twilight in being the dumbest pony in the episode. All around, this was a mess. 3rd worst, Apple Family Reunion. So this episode really isn't that much bad, as much as it's just very unmemorable. I figured it would have been more about, let's say, making sure the reunion was actually operating smoothly, but Applejack bit off more than she could chew and was basically trying to do everything on her own. Though at that point, this episode would probably just be another Applebuck season. Maybe it could have been like Applejack was seeing problems that weren't really there, instead of basically giving us party pooper pants. Heck, what if this episode came after Pinkie Apple Pie, and we got to see Pinkie Pie in this episode too? Because it's easier to see this plot work for Pinkie Pie, or really any other main six pony, just not Applejack. Overall, that may be the biggest issue with this episode. It's just that Applejack as a character does not really work for this plot. Of the main six, she's by far the most level-headed member. So seeing her hover over everyone like this just seems very unlike her to do. I get that there's a lot of pressure which could very well provoke her to be out of character here, but then the problem comes into the plot itself, where no one can really enjoy the reunion because Applejack is just too caught up in trying to make everything run smoothly according to her. And it's only believable up to a certain extent. Like, I can kinda get why Apple Bloom doesn't say anything, but why not Granny Smith? She doesn't argue with Applejack with her rocking chairs being thrown out, despite the fact that she's an elderly pony now being forced to stand. All this adds up to the ending feeling less like a labor of love, and just instead being more work on top of what already was being put up with. So I don't really like this episode very much at all. Number 2, One Bad Apple. Originally, I was ready to rank this episode as dead last, but unlike the last episode, I have some respect for this one. Bullying is an incredibly nuanced subject. I wouldn't expect this show to go too hard on the subject, and its moral for the most part is fine. For this story, it also makes sense that approaching an adult is a smart way to begin tackling the issue when it's a family issue between Apple Bloom and her friends versus her cousin and the Phillies of finance. I also really like the song in this episode, and it shows just how ineffective trying to avoid a bully can be. Unfortunately, the third act for this episode is really bad, and Sweetie Belle, despite her own inclination to go to an adult, is mostly swept under the rug. I still have no idea why Applejack would find it appropriate to mention Babs had a bullying problem back in her hometown when she was A, at was by and large a commemorative setting, and B, in front of both Apple Bloom and her friends, despite previously not thinking it was even ideal to share the information with her little sister earlier, when she and Babs are cousins. And it isn't like there aren't any logical methods of bringing the information to light earlier either. I wish what the writer did was have Sweetie Belle at least attempt to get Applejack on her side, but she didn't believe her because of knowing what Babs was dealing with, but I've talked at length about this already in a previous video. I also really dislike how this episode says that you're a bully for fighting back against a bully. I knew what the writer was trying to say, you're no better than a bully by returning fire and stooping to their level. But there isn't enough impact gotten across with that message for it to really ring. The problem is that it isn't uncommon that adults cannot help out kids who need it. I understand though that there really is only so much an episode can do, and I applaud the writer for at least giving us a mostly complete story. But I also would have appreciated if this episode ended by following through with its moral and had Applejack do more than just stare angrily at Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon. And now, the worst episode of Season 3 of this show, Spike at Your Service. I'm only as far as Season 5, but in every season up to then, the worst episodes of the season are generally centered around Spike, with the only exception being maybe Season 1 with Feeling Pinky Keen. Spike at Your Service may not be the worst of them, but it's definitely the least coherent. This episode goes beyond poorly representing Spike, and takes it from being out of character to out of this show's canon. Apparently, Twilight's diligent, tidy, and savvy assistant is a bumbling buffoon when he isn't around her. This wouldn't be a problem considering the fact that Spike's a baby, except that Spike has regularly demonstrated behavior prior to this episode, showing he is significantly more competent than his portrayal here displays. There's also this dragon code that apparently is just super important to dragons despite ponies knowing nothing about them. Maybe it's exclusive to Spike, but even that does not explain Spike being so ready to give up being Twilight's assistant. Especially knowing what his greatest fear is, as revealed in the literal Season 3 premiere. But that alone would not rank the episode dead last. No, what ranks this episode where it is has to do with not only how Spike is portrayed, but also Applejack, and to a lesser extent Twilight. For the former, this girl can stop a barreling wagon with nothing but her hind legs and buck trees so hard she causes apples to fall. But a wee pebble the size of a foot isn't enough to pin her in place. That doesn't make any sense. Regarding Twilight, maybe it is in character for her to be as absorbed in her reading as she is in this episode. It wouldn't be the first time after all, but it doesn't lead well into making the story any stronger or making Twilight any more likable. All it really does for me is make me resent just how she's Spike's guardian and is so oblivious to something that should be extremely important to him. It's also just really strange how she's okay with Spike swearing eternal servitude. You don't think that's just a wee bit excessive of a term to base a moral code around? And depending on when this moral code was established, don't you think it's weird how Applejack gets the life debt payment, but not other ponies like Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy when they say them in Secret by Excess? Or Cadence in the Crystal Empire? Honestly, it's a shame because this episode does have some funny moments, but if humor could save an episode, it couldn't be this one. And now you know my worst 6 episodes of My Little Pony Season 3. As for my 6 best, that'll come out on a later date. And eventually, I promise, I'll get around to Season 5 being reviewed. Thank you for watching, I'll see you later.